Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. My name's Tom. I work with the client engagement team here at aXcelerate. And today is our second session in finance training within aXcelerate. So on the screen, you'll see that this is session 9 of 13 today. And it's a follow-on to the finance session we had last Tuesday. Now, the knowledge obtained in finance session 1 is absolutely crucial for what we discussed today. So if you haven't seen that session and you're watching this as a recording, I do recommend going back and watching the earlier one. Otherwise, I will be posting a link to the earlier session at the conclusion of today's webinar. So we're going to start off today by having a quick little refresher on what was discussed in the first session and how we tie that into what we're going to be looking at today. I'm going to be setting up a class from scratch, and I'm going to show you guys the recommended way that we set up invoices in aXcelerate. There are a number of ways it can be achieved, but the way I'll show you is our recommended method. We're going to have a look at issuing an invoice to a student, and that's going to include issuing an invoice number, locking and finalizing the invoice so no further changes can be made, sending that invoice to the contact. We're also going to show how you record payments in aXcelerate. And I'm going to differentiate the difference between an offset and a refund, which will tie us into the conclusion, which will be looking at credit notes. So guys, to get started, I'm going to jump into my aXcelerate account. Now, the things that we need to know for what was discussed last time, and let me try and move this out of the way. There we go. In our last session, we had a look at the crucial system settings. Now, they lay within your additional options. So before we touch on anything that's being looked at today, you'll have to go into your system settings and follow the setup that was outlined in finance session 1. We also had a very brief look at the finance management tab, which we're going to be looking at in a lot more detail today. We had a look at the items list, finance codes, and finance models. All of these will be utilized in the sessions today. And there are a few other options here that we haven't touched on because they're not too relevant for what we're looking at today. They're much more advanced use of aXcelerate. So we're going to get started by setting up a class that has an invoice number, an invoice amount associated with it. To do that, we need to start with a qualification. So for example, I'm going to go in to my enrollment option 1 of the certificate 4 in work health and safety. Now, what I've done, this is an example that we looked at in an earlier refresher training session. But since then, I've come in and added a qualification cost of $15,000. What this means is that now that this is set here, whenever I create a class using this qualification, it's automatically going to tell aXcelerate that each student needs to pay $15,000. So I'm going to set this up now to show you how it looks. We're going to go into courses and classes. I'm going to quickly copy this qualification code so I don't forget it. Now I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to choose enrollment option 1. This is the qualification that I just added. And now if I scroll down, you'll see the course fee is set to $15,000 because this is being pulled from the qualification. Now I'm going to quickly go through and set up this class very basically. If you want to learn more about setting up classes, then I recommend watching our earlier refresher training session on class setup. Just for today, I'm going to fly through so I can show you the invoicing side. Invoicing example, and I'm going to make this a 1-week class. I'm going to include 1 extra elective, and I'm going to create this. Again, a very simple example just to show you the invoice functionality within aXcelerate. So I've created this class, and everything looks exactly as per normal. Let's enroll a student, and I'm going to admit Arthur. Here he is. Let's get him in here. to move my laptop, click and roll. There we go. Now, scrolling down, this all looks very similar. We can't see any pricing information on this page because we're only talking about the compliance level information here. When we actually proceed to the next page, it's going to ask us to confirm the payment details. So I'm going to go through and enroll. Again, if you wanted to learn more about what was on that previous page, please view our earlier class refresher training session. Now, what we'll see here is the students being enrolled. We get that confirmation at the top. And now we're being asked to generate an invoice for this student. Now, you'll notice that it says student contribution is $15,000 because again, that was set up at the qualification level. So it automatically fed through to the class, which is now automatically feeding through to this student. However, there is further customization we can do to this invoice. Finance model. This is something we looked at in the last session. And just a reminder, if you go to finance and finance models, you'll see that there. And I've set up a couple of options. For this particular qualification, I have set up one option that is for domestic fee-for-service students and another for employer-funded students. So as an example, I'm going to select domestic fee-for-service students. And in the setup of this finance model, which I'll quickly open it in another tab and show you, might move this out of the way so I can click on that. You'll see here that I've set up the domestic fee for students finance model to charge the student 100% of the tuition fee, which is $15,000, which we can see at the top. You can say the student's paying 100%, or you can say the student's paying the full amount. I personally prefer the 100% method because what it allows us to do is easily set up another payment or finance model for example, employer funded. Now, to make a bit more sense of that, I'm actually going to jump back into the qualification fees screen, and I'm going to toggle between domestic fee for service and employer funded, which is another finance model I have set up. And you'll notice that now the student is paying nothing and the employer is paying the full amount. Now, you'll see here that this example student hasn't been linked to an organization, but if they were, their organization's contact, which again, we looked at in an earlier contact refresher training session, will be displayed here, and they'll be the person who appears on the invoice. Just as an example, I'm going to jump back into finance models here, and I'm going to show you the employer funded option. And you'll see that I've selected employer funded and they pay 100%. You can, of course, change it to be per qualification, per unit, etc. But we did look at that in the previous session, so I won't touch on that today. Now that I've said that they're a fee-for-service student, I need to also add a finance code. Now, this is very important, especially if you're using third-party finance software such as MYOB or Xero. And this is used to track the payment as per the codes that you guys have set up. Now, as an example, the way I've set these up here is I have two codes here. One for two different qualification streams, but I'm going to select option one because that's applicable for me today. And all that does is categorizes it, especially on the invoice, so that we at a glance know that this is a tuition fee for this particular class. Now, just to quickly show you, I'm going to jump into finance codes. And just as a reminder, there's a lot of flexibility around how it's set up. I can't tell you what to put in here. It really just comes down to your internal processes. And if you're not too sure, definitely contact your finance team. Don't just start popping stuff in here because they may have their own codes that they use to track that information. Now, we've added the finance model. We've also added the finance code. And so we can see the students being billed $15,000. Now, this payment plan here is a bit more advanced, so I won't be looking at it in these refresher training sessions. And I'm now going to scroll down to the action field. Now, if I simply click view the enrollment summary and submit, it doesn't actually create an invoice for this student. It simply says, hey, it almost sets up like a draft being like, hey, this person should be paying $15,000, but we haven't yet set up and issued the invoice. But in this example today, what I want to do is actually issue and send that invoice to the student. So I'm going to select the first option here, set up the student invoice now, and click submit. Now, this is going to get us to confirm some details very quickly. Now, purchase order numbers are not required, but again, your finance team probably has their own way of tracking this information. So you can pop in any finance or purchase order number there you like. Tuition invoice items, so we'll see that this is pulling across from the previous page. We're saying that the full amount for their enrollment is $15,000. You can customize it further, but this again starts getting a bit more advanced and won't be what we're looking at today. Now, additional invoice items. In the previous session, we looked at items list. I'm going to open this in another tab briefly. And I've set up a textbook for this particular qualification. Now I'll just move my camera away and open this up. So the way I've set this up is for the Cert 4 in Work Health and Safety. This is the textbook that costs $80. And what we want to do, I'm going to jump back to the invoice tab now. We want to charge this student for a textbook because it's required for their studies. So I'm going to click additional item and I'm going to click textbook. Again, because I had set it up as an item in an item list. And this now is appearing on the invoice as an additional item. You can go in and further customize the price from here. You can increase the quantity that they are being sold, and you can include or exclude GST as required. Now I'm going to create this invoice, and it's navigated us to the finance management screen. We looked at this very, very briefly in the first session, but we've ended up back here now. We're viewing Arthur's invoice for his certificate 4 in work health and safety. And you'll see that the total owing is $15,080. However, notice at the top here, invoice number is not issued. If we sent this invoice to the student, they would receive the invoice, but there would be no invoice number, which could lead to confusion. What you'll need to do once the invoice is actually confirmed and you're happy with the information on here, down the bottom, you click Issue Invoice Number and click Save. What this then does is generates an invoice number as per the settings setup that we looked at in Finance Session 1. So here's our invoice number at the top. Now, if I click More Options, we can finalize and lock line items. So what this does, if we are 100% happy with this invoice, we know that nothing is going to change and we don't want anyone else to come in here and edit the invoice. We can lock the line items, which locks, the line number 1, line number 2, and then we finalize the invoice to show there's no further changes to be made. I'm now going to save. We've locked this invoice. We can see there's the little padlock at the top here. And even if you click it, you can't unlock it. So be certain that you're locking it for the right reasons. Again, it should only be to prevent future changes, not just a random thing you do as part of your finalization process. Now, this student, we need to send them the invoice. So what we do is we hover over send and click. Now, within every aXcelerate account, there are some default templates that we set up when creating your organization's account. So if you type in tax, you should have a tax invoice /receipt template in there So I'm going to utilize this as the example. Now, this is very similar to what we covered in our earlier contact management webinar. So if you're not too sure how to set up templates, I certainly recommend going back and watching that earlier session. But I'm going to assume everyone's knowledge is on the same page, and I'm going to continue through, and we're going to utilize this tax invoice template to send to the student. Now we need to give it a moment because it's actually generating the template with all the appropriate information. And so we'll see here, assessment feature demo, which is my organization's name. If Arthur had any address information, it would appear at the top here. All the invoice details, such as number, order number, date, etc., and any payment plans or anything like that would appear on the invoice. And of course, the line items with the description and the corresponding price. If there's any fields here that aren't populating properly, it'll be because, just like we discussed in the earlier communication refresher, it will be because you're either not sending the invoice template from the correct location, or this particular field doesn't actually have any information to display. So if you're utilizing the method outlined by me today, this will all populate on the default template with no problem. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to email this to Arthur by clicking email down the bottom. Now, one thing you'll notice here is it's asking me to select a template, and it's saying that the tax invoice is attaching as a template. That's because this particular template is set up as an attachment as opposed to an email. And we can see that here in the format. It says send template as a PDF. So the student is actually receiving their invoice as a PDF attachment that they can then download and forward to people as required. And what we're going to do is use another template as the body for that email. So email content, I'm going to go in here and type in, I think it was invoice I called it. Now I've called it invoice notice VFH, and that has the body of my email. And again, the invoice is going to be attached to that. I'm now going to send this to the student, and voila, they have just been issued their invoice. The students come to us now, and they want to pay $80 towards their total amount. I'm going to show you how we record that. So we're still on Arthur's invoice. On the left here, I'm going to hover over payments and click record payment. Now, if he's paid us $80 cash, we simply write $80 and select cash. I always recommend adding a receipt number. Again, to know what your receipt number is, please speak to your finance team. I'm just going to add an example placeholder in here today. A description could be anything you want. It's not a required field. So you could say, Arthur paid off his textbook expenses, just as an example. And I can never spell right as I'm in a webinar. Sorry, guys. There we go. It's a bit better. Save that payment. Now, if I come in here, oh, where have I gone? I've clicked something on my mouse. That's what we want. You'll see his balance has now updated. He only owes $15,000 because he's already made an $80 contribution to that total amount. Now, one thing I do want to discuss is offsets versus refunds. So let's just say that Arthur approached us and he said, look, I really don't want to study this course. I've only been with you guys for a week. Is it possible I could have a refund? To do that, you would need to issue a credit note. But it's very important to keep in mind that an offset is very different to a refund. So as an example, if Arthur hadn't approached the organization and he had just flat out, you've been chasing him up for months and months to get him to make the payment and he's just refusing, he's dropped off the face of the earth, you can't get in touch with him, you can offset the amount to, I suppose, remove that from the invoice. Now, that would be a very particular example, and it does not happen often. I just wanted to highlight the difference between issuing a refund and adding an offset to an invoice. I'm going to show you how we can issue a refund. So Arthur has specifically said, I don't want to take this course anymore, and I want my $80 back that I've paid you guys for the textbook. We need to literally transfer him $80, and we need to keep a record of that in a credit note. So we're going to hover over More and click Create Credit Note. Now, in this particular situation, we could unlock, keeping in mind you need specific finance permissions within your system users in order to unlock invoices. So hypothetically, we could come in here and make changes if we wanted to. You know, we could just remove the 15 grand or however you guys wanted to go about it. I'm going to come in here and relock this. And we're going to just flat out issue a credit note. We're going to transfer $80 straight into Arthur's bank account. So let's create a credit note. And I'm only going to tick the textbook because that's the item we're crediting. And I might say Arthur called back to cancel his enrollment. He asked us to refund his textbook, which he has returned. And I'm going to create a credit note. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to move us to a new screen, crediting. And you'll see at the top here, we're now on credit note instead of invoice. And you'll see that this is now credit for Arthur. This works very similarly to invoices. So again, you can see the credit note number hasn't been issued because we haven't issued a credit note number. We can also select more options and lock and finalize. For this example, I'm only going to issue and I'm going to select save. Now, let's record a refund. So just like we did with the invoice, instead of this saying payments, it says refunds. We hover over here and record a refund. We're going to say that we deposited $80 directly into Arthur's bank account. So we could say textbook refund and save the refund. And you'll now see that this has been credited. So it's confirmation that Arthur wanted a refund on his $80 textbook. We have processed that refund and we've added confirmation to aXcelerate that that amount has now been credited. The credit note number has again been generated as per the system settings setup from finance session 1. And if we want to send this to the student, it's the exact same process as sending an invoice. I'm going to select send. Now, in a perfect world, you would have your own credit note template, but I think this is actually still going to work. No, here we go. So you do need your own credit note template. Now, this is what I was referring to earlier, where if these fields don't work, it's because you're not sending it from the correct location. So because we're trying to populate invoice fields in a credit note section, it's not populating properly. I'm actually not too sure if I've got a credit note template. Let's have a look. No, I don't. So you would need to set up a credit note template, which could just be as simple as duplicating your invoice template and replacing the invoice fields with credit note fields. But I won't be showing you that today because with the knowledge obtained in the earlier communication refresher training session, you guys will be able to achieve that. Now, guys, that's all that I had in store for us today. So if you're watching this live, please hang around for a little bit longer and we will have a Q&A. But just as a summary, in regards to what we have discussed today, we briefly, I should say, had another look at what we discussed in the last session on finance. I then showed you how we set up a class once we have added payment information to a qualification. And that then allows us to create an invoice when enrolling a student. I then showed you the process of creating that invoice, which includes issuing an invoice number, locking and finalizing the invoice, sending it to a contact, recording payments. And I also showed you the difference between, an offset, which is just flat out changing the amount on an invoice, versus a refund, which is a credit note that has a literal recording that you have refunded the student. So guys, our next session is going to be on a VETMIS reporting, and that's going to be next Tuesday, the 27th of July. The world of a VETMIS is absolutely riveting, as I'm sure you guys know. So if there's anything that you guys want to learn, I'm going to be showing you how to run a VETMIS reports from aXcelerate. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend coming along. I'm sure a lot of you will be, because a VETMIS is very heavily tied into compliance. Again, if you're watching this live, please feel free to hang around, because I'll be reading the questions in the chat shortly. But if you've been watching this as a recording, thank you very much for joining me once again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. See you later, guys.